Welcome to Of Mics and Memory Cards, a complete rundown of the PlayStation 1 game library, all 4,105 of them. My name is Tyler, and today I am joined by
Jacob
and Kameron.
And today we are talking about Armored Core 1, Armored Core for the PS1. Now, this was my first experience with the series. Has anyone else played any Armored Core before?
I have not. This was also my very first experience with it.
I've actually played, I think it was Armored Core 2 for the PlayStation 2, and I had no idea what I was doing, pretty much.
It's not an easy game. It's very, very clunky. But in like a...
I went into it like not knowing like how important customizing your mech was. So I don't even know how far I got. Maybe just a handful of missions in where there was this gap that I was supposed to clear. And I think my mech was supposed to be able to like jump over it with like its thrusters or something like that. But I could never make it over this large gap. And I didn't realize it was because like my mech was just not customized for it. I didn't change out any parts, or every time I tried to change out parts, it was like, oh, your mech is too heavy, or, you know, it's not right for, you know, this kind of build. So I didn't know what I was doing, and I eventually gave up on that. On it.
Was that for this one or for Armored Core 2?
For Armored Core 2. That was really my only experience with Armored Core before I played this one for the first time. The first one for the first time.
Good for you, because that was my experience with this version of Armored Core, where I was like...
I was going to say, I had very much a similar experience. I do feel like I kind of got it near the end, but it's very much the RPG build thing of the customization is almost more important than actually being any good at the game. If you customize it right, you're not playing it that much. It's very interesting and very different than what I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, we'll get into some of the some of the little gameplay loops that I discovered just from your research for this episode, so we'll get to that later. I didn't know that this was a thing that the game allowed, so that'll be fun. That'll be fun to talk about.
Absolutely.
Now, does anyone have any history with FromSoft, the developers of this game?
Yeah, I'm a huge From Software gamer. I first got into them with the release of Demon's Souls on the PlayStation 3. It was actually a high school friend of mine, shout out to Luke Pitek, who got me into it, lent it to me. I took it to college, and that freshman year, when I first met you guys, I was hosting, not really hosting, but like I would be playing the game in my dorm room, and whether it was my first roommate bringing back his girlfriend, or my second roommate, Parsons. That would be wild if Jordan Peterson was my college roommate.
Dude, what was he like back then?
But no, when he would bring his girlfriend, he would bring Naomi back, and they would just watch me play Demon's Souls in my dorm room and get super suckered into it. But I very quickly fell in love with that game, and then when Dark Souls came out, I completed that one, Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, Sekiro, Bloodborne, Elden Ring. No From Software game has arrived in my hands that hasn't been beaten by me, except for the Armored Core games.
Right on.
In fact, actually, I do want to just add real quickly, I think if it wasn't for... they came along at the right time for me, because my gaming habits, especially just, you know, we're all in our 30s, but have changed and warped and just evolved in so many different ways and in many different directions over time. But the actual just core gameplay of the Soulsborne genre has kept me, I think, a gamer all this time, when otherwise I might have faded away, particularly in that PS3, Xbox 360 generation, when games were just not as varied, in my opinion.
That's fair enough.
Cam, what's your experience with FromSoft?
I have a little more experience with their other games than I did with Armored Core. Dark Souls was my first Souls-like game, and I actually did beat that one. I didn't know summoning was a thing, so I did Ornstein and Smog all on my own, and so that's like my one true achievement when it comes to these Souls games, because everything else I'm okay at. I did play Dark Souls 2 and 3. I haven't beaten those. I'm actually replaying through 3 again. Like, I started from the beginning, and I've gotten much further than I did in my last playthrough. And then I haven't played Bloodborne, but I do plan to get there at some point. And I haven't played Sekiro either. And same with Elden Ring. I have it, but I have not gotten very far. I defeated Margit and I think a couple of other major bosses after that, but I also haven't finished it, but that's pretty much my experience with the Souls games that have sort of, my love for them sort of reignited, talking about Armored Core and also playing Lies of P, which I'm going to plug that game. It's also really good.
Plug that game. You've talked about that game every episode of this show that we've done
Heck
so
yes,
far.
because it needs to be known.
I personally am then definitely the least FromSoft active person here. I've played a bit of Demon's Souls, bounced off it pretty hard. I've played a bit of Dark Souls, bounced off it pretty hard. I have gotten farther in Bloodborne than in any other one. Bloodborne, I got to, Vom the Vicious Spider, the one where you jump in the moon, in the ocean, and then you fight the big spindly spider. I never got past him, and in general, it's just not something that has vibed with me, though I recognize its worth. And I've played Souls-adjacent games, the 2 Jedi games that are clearly inspired by the Soulsborns, 2D Soulsborns, Hollow Knight, as well as stuff that, is tangentially related, at least using the same control scheme like the new God of Wars or something. So I've played a lot of stuff that has been clearly influenced by it. And again, it's not like I think the games are bad. I recognize that they're quite good, but it's just something that I haven't been able to find the time or the patience for. And I generally haven't been connected online either, so the summoning thing has been something I've missed out on as well.
Yeah.
Is this a case of, because one of the common complaints I hear about From Software's output is, and people complain about this with like Hollow Knight as well, which is that you don't get to spawn right at the boss. Like once you reach the boss, you do have to work your way through like a pretty large corridor of combat before you get to the boss, and then you do. And so if you die, to have to do all of that time and time and time again, people just are like, I have a life to live. I don't want to do this.
It was the time investment for a lot of them, or that feeling of just utter defeat when you've made it really far in a section and are like, okay, where's the save point, and then die, and then go back all the way to the next spot you would spawn from, and just seeing, like literally in the draw distance, seeing the distance that you went and that you have to do it all over again. That's typically what knocks me out. It's not even like a number of deaths, it's just the weight of even just a single one where I look and I'm like, I don't really want to do that again, and I know that if I put the time into one of them, I will connect with it eventually. I feel like I got really close with Bloodborne and just kind of fell off it and never got back on. But I'm sure if I went to like maybe the first Dark Souls or Elden Ring specifically, I'd like to give a shot, because I really haven't played more than an hour when I borrowed it from a library once. But, FromSoft is, I wouldn't say I have like a contentious relationship with them or anything. I've played some of their other non-series related games, which I'll shout out later on, but just haven't touched either of these series, really, the Soulsborne or the Armored Core stuff, in any sort of really meaningful way.
Right on.
And for Lies of P, since this is obviously the first time I've brought this game up, it fixes a lot of those issues. They like the save point is pretty much like right outside of the boss's door, and like I guess the game's equivalent of your souls that you lose. It also spawns outside of the boss door, so you can go grab your souls and like take it with you and level up if you need to, and you don't really fight any enemy between the save point and the boss door, which I'm like, this is what I needed. This is exactly what I needed, and it helped me get back into the other Souls games where I know it's going to be much more of a challenge, but like I expect it, and yeah.
I had absolutely no clue that the P in Lies of P stood for pussies.
Let me tell you, just because it gives you some quality of life improvements doesn't mean that the combat is pretty much just as difficult.
Get good. Get good. Oh, God.
Oh.
Something in my throat. I'm so
you
sorry.
got something in your throat? That's weird, huh? Interesting.
Before we devolve too far, I think we should probably get into the history of From Software and Armored Core. Now, as we've been talking, you, the audience, know From Software, even if you don't know the name. They make Dark Souls, Sekiro, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring, notoriously difficult, meticulous, unrelenting, painful, and glorious experiences that you either love, hate, or you love and hate simultaneously. But before they made games like Dark Souls, they made games that were like Dark Souls, beginning their game development journey with Kingsfield, the proto-Souls-like and surprise first RPG for the PlayStation 1. And at some point we'll do a deep dive into that series, but to get to Armored Core, we're going to go even further back, deep into the Japanese bubble economy of 1986. Now, From Software got its start not making games, but business applications. There's not much on the English-speaking web that I can locate that goes into greater detail than that. I believe it was generally described as productivity software. They were formed in 1986, but their first game, Kingsfield, was not released until 1994. That means for that almost a decade, they weren't really game developers, they were just game fans. Kingsfield was an early release, being something like the 11th or 12th game to come out on the PS1 in Japan. This also makes it the first RPG for the system. This was followed by Kingsfield 2 in 1995, which was translated into English the following year, doing that confusing thing where they call it Kingsfield 1 for our region. We don't need to worry about it right now. Now, both Kingsfield games are slow and deliberate first-person dungeon crawlers, and very clearly the prototypes for what would become Dark Souls. The morality is gray, the world is bleak, the story is told in snippets by unreliable NPCs and in item descriptions. It's hard on purpose, it doesn't hold your hand, demanding that you meet the game, rather than the game stooping to your level to give easy satisfaction. Now, prior to developing Kingsfield, FromSoft originally planned on making a game about small robots navigating a maze. However, what they wanted to do wasn't feasible in the early 90s based on the power of personal computers at that time. This idea would then be revisited after they began to cut their teeth on the PS1, and would serve as the kernel of an idea that would pop into Armored Core, their next game. According to a 1997 interview in the official Japanese PlayStation magazine with producer Yasuyoshi Karasawa, programmer Ichi Hasegawa, and mecha designer Shoji Kawamori, Armored Core's designs developed initially with Karasawa, who also worked on the first Kingsfield. He says, somewhat contradictory to the early idea of the tiny robot in the maze, that he was too busy while making Kingsfield 1 and 2 to think about Armored Core. What I think this means is that the game's focus on combat was not their original vision. Further mucking this up, however, is that mecha designer Shoji Kawamori claimed in an interview with Forbes in 2015 that he was contacted prior to the launch of the PlayStation, also meaning prior to the launch of either Kingsfield, thusly meaning that he would have been reached out to by a productivity software company with no games under their belt about developing for an unreleased system. So another theory could be that Kingsfield and Armored Core were being worked on somewhat in tandem, or that he simply got his timeline mixed up 20-ish years after the fact.
I have a hard time really accepting that From Software began making business applications, particularly productivity software, when I don't think anything has been more detrimental to my own productivity than From Software games. Collectively, probably 1,000 hours I've lost to those games. Like, what could I have done? I could have done so many things in 1,000 hours.
I think them being influenced by, like, the Japanese bubble economy and economics of the 1980s sort of goes into that crushing philosophy, because it's probably how they felt when they were working salaryman jobs. That same sort of weight of expectation and bosses, literal bosses, that would just chew you up and spit you out. I think all of this, man, the timeline makes sense to me.
You know what? I can buy that. I can buy that the Japanese bubble economy of the late 80s and early 90s is the metaphor of the world in Dark Souls.
The Dark Souls are the souls of the Japanese salarymen who have to go in and sit at their computers while a man in a suit watches over them very closely going,
Their first bosses were actually a tandem duo named, what was it, Kameron?
Ornstein and Smog.
Ornstein
Well,
and
here's a
Smog,
quote
yeah.
from programmer Aichi Hasegawa explaining the development process.
The basic system hasn't changed much over the course of the development, but the direction we're taking the game in has changed a lot. In the beginning, Armored Core was more of an adventure-type game. I wrote a function that loaded the graphics from the CD silently in the background, like the Kingsfield series, in order to make the movement between the layers look smooth. That way, the game wouldn't be interrupted while loading assets. Unfortunately, when we changed the game to a stage-based mission format, the code was no longer needed.
By basic system, he may be referring to the fact that Armored Core technically runs on the Kingsfield engine, and though the perspective is different, the controls are actually shockingly similar, navigating like a tank and using the shoulder buttons to strafe or look up and down. The game was a fair way into development before the team began to realize their mecha designs just weren't up to snuff. This is when they reached out to famed mecha designer Shoji Kawamori. His influence on the mecha anime genre is really hard to overstate. He created Macross, which was the basis of Robotech in America, and many of his designs for a toy line called Diaclone were adapted as the initial Transformers for the US audience. This man designed Optimus Prime, for God's sakes, and more or less created the concept of the transforming robot in mecha anime.
What?
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
That's wild. I would not have thought that the Transformers were a part of the same translation that, like, Super Sentai was in like becoming Power Rangers, that it was designed in Japan and then just sort of interpreted and perverted
kind
a
of
little
like
bit.
cut and paste.
I mean, Optimus Prime is a big, he's like an oil rig, right? He's an 18-wheeler.
Yeah, he's known as Convoy in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I was going to say, there's no 18-wheelers in Japan. That's a completely different truck.
There is something about some Japanese mech designers or tech designers where they do take a lot of influence from American machine design, and you can see that a lot. There's a specific name for folks like, oh my god, who developed Metal Gear Solid? Hideo Kojima. But that kind of the fetishization of weaponry and really complex American machines and industrialization, there's an influence there on some mech design and other sorts of machine design in Japanese culture, specifically like manga and anime, that I've noticed.
There's just not really another culture that does mechs the way Japan does, in the way that they're personalized. They feel, I understand that fetishization of Western machinery, but there's also this like personality element to it. I wonder if there's more here that I'm just not connecting, like the way that maybe, I don't know, maybe it even goes back to like kamikaze jets and the sort of intricate tying of identity of your own life to the craft that you're manning. I don't know. I think there might be something there that could explain the Japanese relationship to mechs, but I don't know what it is.
It's kind of like the mech itself is sort of a stand-in for the person's body. Like this kind of goes back to like the original Mobile Suit Gundam, where and I think the reason they use children as pilots, or like young adults or teenagers as pilots, is it's supposed to kind of represent when you get into a mech. And I think we'll talk about this when it comes to the controls for Armored Core 2, but when it comes to the mech, it's like you're using a foreign body and you're kind of coming to grips with it. Like, you know, you start off and you're not really good at piloting it. It's clunky. You'll mess up from from time to time. Like, lives will be lost because of your mistakes. But then the more you grow as a pilot, the more in tune you become with your mech. And it's supposed to be like I don't know, coming to terms with yourself as a soldier, or coming to terms with yourself as you know, accepting your destiny as some kind of like killer or something like that. I was
gonna say, the way you describe it makes it sound like a puberty metaphor, right? Like a body that is unfamiliar to you.
It kind of is, and a similar thing. There are similar themes in the magical girl genre of anime, but you know, for female characters, like for the boys, it's the mecha. For the girls, it's like it's like Sailor Moon, and it's a pretty similar concept there.
I would love if one of the Gundam, like either the anime or a movie, ended and it does like a slow pan out from, you know, the pilot's face, and he's grown a little older and wizened, and then it zooms out and you see the mecha, and then in the background you just hear, I guess this is growing up, and then it goes
I was expecting
and that's the end.
I was expecting the Linkin Park, the what I've done.
That would work too.
That's for Americans.
Yeah.
I think the other thing to remember about a lot of anime and manga, and it's funny that you mention it as kind of like a growing up or a puberty. A lot of anime and manga is not really meant for adults to view or read. It is specifically targeted towards like teenage audiences. That is what like the shonen and is it seinen?
No, seinen is like an older boy demographic.
What's the like teenage girl?
Shoujo maybe?
No, you're right. Especially that show from a couple of years ago, Darling in the Franxx, which was clearly directed towards young people. Basically, Shinzo Abe turning towards the entirety of Japan and saying, "Please fuck, please, please, for me. Don't you love me? Do you love me? Please fuck if you love me."
I haven't seen it, but I've heard it's very heteronormative.
Extremely, extremely.
Now, Kawamori, the designer we were talking about, was not a game designer or even a player. He said that he was too busy for any of that. When FromSoft reached out, all he'd heard about them was that they were people who, quote, create extremely hardcore games for maniacs. Which I think is the most accurate sentence about that company I've ever heard. Originally, his designs were too complex to render in polygons. He used these designs then for cinematics and made more simplistic designs that are angular for the gameplay itself. But I find the amount of work that he put in fascinating. Here's a quote from Kawamori.
I drew about 6 layout blueprints for each of the basic cores, showing them from different angles. Then, using copies of those layouts as a reference, I designed the parts so they could be attached to each core. In this way, I was able to preserve a sense of integration in the designs. I double-checked every part I designed against each core. Like Kurosawa said about not wanting to have an ultimate strongest weapon, I also thought it would be boring if there were one design that everyone wanted, that stood out above the others. So I tried to make every part unique, so the choices would be meaningful.
I think he succeeded.
I mean, yeah, he pretty much lays it out. There's a level of complexity that they were prepared to create.
I was honestly desperate for there to be a strongest design that I could chase for, so it would kind of root me in something. Being left to my own devices, I was very, not confused, but I struggled.
It's definitely a game that I think benefits from having guides, or at least having a little bit of hints. I did watch a lot of YouTube videos on it before I could really feel like I was getting any sense of enjoyment out of it, which I think is another kind of FromSofty thing where I think they encourage collaboration, or at least that kind of, quote-unquote schoolyard talk, where folks get together who have both played the game and talk about their unique builds or stuff that they've noticed. And the game, I think, is also supposed to be either replayed or restarted, and we'll talk about that mechanic later on. But it lends itself well to not going in blind. I think it lends itself well to going in with some ideas, maybe after playing a couple missions on your own, but some ideas of what builds would work and also what items interact with other items, because it's something I did not get at first. When I bought my first item, had enough money for it, and it was like, you don't have enough energy. I was like, what does that mean? I don't know.
Yeah, fully. I was like, oh, I need more energy? Then I'll go buy a different... It wasn't a core, it was a generator, right, is what it's called. And finally, I had enough money for that. I bought that. But then it was like, okay, well, now I have enough energy to power this, but it's too heavy for me to use. And I'm all like, well, then what do you want from me, game?
It's a constant process of, selling legs and then testing out some other legs that you buy and finding out those legs don't work. And then buying new arms and selling those arms and buying a head and thinking, can I get by without a head? There was one point where I had only one of 3 weapons and was just like, I'm really hoping I don't run out of bullets because everything else is too heavy. So a few other key developers include Toshifumi Nabeshima, who was the director of the game. This is straight up his first game credit. He sticks around as a producer of the series up through Armored Core 5, which itself kind of tanked, and then directed the absolute bomb called Left Alive for the PS4, and now he doesn't really work that much.
That's what you get when you peak too early.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's part of it. If you're stuck in sort of older game design philosophies and can't sort of roll with the punches, it's sort of hard to stick with the industry. There's also Yasuyoshi Karasawa, who was the head producer. He had been with FromSoft for Kingsfield 1 and 2, and then left the industry after the Armored Core PS1 expansions. So he was only with FromSoft and the games industry for that little brief, 5-year period of time. There's Aichi Hasegawa, who was the main programmer with the company since Kingsfield 1, and he has the weirdest work history out of anyone involved here. When you pull up his Moby games, he's got the Kingsfield, and then after Armored Core, he does some work on Final Fantasy X and is special thanks on Kingdom Hearts, and then does a couple like random Square games up to Final Fantasy Type O HD, where he programmed the menus.
What?
So he's working, but just very like background
just kind
stuff.
of all over the place.
Yeah, we've got Romancing Saga for the PS2 as a battle programmer, which is like his only programming work for an RPG. And then some other programmers are Hiroyuki Arai, who worked on Kingsfield 1, 2, and 3. He sticks with the company following this up till now. And then Masayuki Saito, who starts with Armored Core and only works in little fits and starts after. So all that to say, my point being that the team was a mix of the old FromSoft guard from the previous two Kingsfield, and then absolute total newbies, some of which stick with the industry and some of which just totally dip out. And the thing that I've always wondered about is like where the newbies come from. Like how you get hired on as a director with no previous experience in the games industry. I do not know how that happens.
That is really curious, but I find myself wondering because we've talked in previous episodes about the shift from a single story creator game design up to larger, we described it before as like more filmic, large crews working on these games. And it makes me think here that you do have somebody, probably someone with the money at the top, who is thinking, okay, well, if we're really wanting to push the envelope, if we're trying to do something interesting, a lot of these ideas are not going to come from industry professionals. We want to bring in people that we can trust, but who will also be bringing in the kind of innovative thought that can only be achieved when you're working with someone who doesn't really understand what the conventional rules and the conventional system of play is.
And then I think there's also maybe some credits that they've got on games that, you know, don't show up on Moby Games. It's possible that they had a portfolio of, like, not fan games, but stuff that they'd just programmed in their spare time that was never, like, a full release, but they were maybe shopping around to companies like, here's the stuff I've made.
You could also think about like how much these people, if they are building like productivity apps and just other business forward software and programming, that what they're developing by doing that is an understanding of the human psyche and sort of the workplace psyche. Because so much of Armored Core, even at the menu, for a game that has a significant amount of its gameplay in whether it's shifting over to your inbox, to read your latest mail, or going into the garage, it is built around this apparatus that really isn't all that different from office work, as we kind of joked about when we got into recording today. And if you understand that, you can build that interface into the game, and you don't have to explain to the player, hey, this is how things work, because they're already intimately familiar with that, especially in Japan at this time.
It does feel like those menus could be, without the dressing, a big Excel spreadsheet where you have to shift things around. They have the automatic, sum totals, and if the sum total is bad, then the Excel rule auto highlights it as, bad and has the red text and the red background. It's like, nope, sorry, your EP's too low. This Excel cell is now red.
Even the idea, like, in the game that, like, you can go into debt by performing poorly, and then you have to dig yourself out of it. It is far too much like real life to be a, like, fun, heavy quotes, gaming experience.
Well, and we will talk later on about how the whole thing is just a metaphor for the way that capitalism degrades morality. But right now, we're still talking about the robots. The modular nature of the mecha came from everyone on the design team thinking different things were cool. So they decided to design a bunch of parts so players could build themselves as a kind of mecha fantasy fulfillment. Originally, the plan was to have hand, shoulder, and arm combos, but this level of complexity was later reduced out of time and tech constraints. They wanted to make sure that there was not one strongest loadout, giving everything pluses and minuses while keeping the identity of each part distinct. Armored Core was released in July of 1997, a full 2 years after the release of Kingsfield 2 in July of 1995. Now, considering that the first Kingsfield was developed in 6 months by a small team, with Armored Core developed in a full 2 years by a larger one, reading between the lines says to me that From was placing a lot of stock on Armored Core's success. It was released a few months later on October 22nd in North America, and then June 1st of 1998 in Europe. It was published by FromSoft themselves in Japan, but by Sony in the US and Europe, which also says to me that Sony had a decent amount of faith in the game themselves.
Did you guys know? So I had originally looked up what the #1 movie in America was on the day of the release of Armored Core in Japan. But now I see that there's actually a much different movie that came out in October, on that weekend of October 22nd. Would you guys like to take a guess as to what Keanu Reeves' picture was the #1 movie in America the day that Armored Core released in the United States?
Speed?
Was it Speed?
It is not Speed, but I like where your brain is at. No, it is The Devil's Advocate with Al Pacino, releasing just in time for Halloween that year.
Funny. I have not seen that film.
I was a little bit happier when it was Men in Black that released that weekend in July when it premiered in Japan.
Iconic, man.
Another story about shady government organizations.
That's really what all art and media should be about. So let's talk about the gameplay loop. It's mission-based, and you play as a Raven, which is a mercenary gun for hire. The tutorial mission, they really just drop you in.
Yeah.
There are, of course, no lessons on the controls. You're dropped into a combat arena with, I think, 3 other mechs and told, like, survive and you will become a Raven. This is your test.
Yeah. What happens if you fail? Does it just restart, or does the game continue? I was really curious because in obviously in like Dark Souls, if you get dropped in, you're supposed to die so that way you can be an undead and it's part of the lore. But I wasn't sure if you die at the beginning of Armored Core, if it's all like restart, or it's like, oh, well, I guess you'll still be a Raven, but you're a lower tiered one or whatever.
We're going to give you some boosts here.
I'm actually not sure. I'm going to see if I can find it. You can definitely fail any mission following that first one, which is the funny thing. The game doesn't really have a dedicated game over screen. You can fail missions and A, not obtain the credits that you would have won from that mission, but B, also lose money credits in repairing your mech and buying more bullets. So if you fail the first mission, you are immediately in debt that is very hard to get out of.
Yeah, that was my exact experience. I lost that first mission and I thought, okay, this is going to be fine, but I didn't realize that I was going to be put in debt. And then I also didn't realize that it wasn't just going to take one mission to like at least get me back even. I would have to do like 3 missions after that to like actually get into the plus side. And I'm like, what am I even going to spend this like little amount of credits on, because all the parts are expensive. And then I chose a mission where the reward was an actual part, and then when I beat that mission, the part I got wasn't compatible with the Armored Core that I already had, and I'm like, why the hell was I even doing all this? God.
I think you can sell parts for as much as you buy them for.
Okay.
Like, the economy sort of doesn't make it sense in that account, but you can sell like your entire mech and then repurchase things, and I think not lose any money in the process.
Oh, that's good.
So like, you don't have to have legs equipped when you go to the garage and when you go to the store. You just do have to have legs equipped by the time you start a mission.
All right.
But you can, in doing that, really put yourself in a spot where you're like, I don't know how to make my mech anymore, which the first time I played the game happened to me, where I was like, I don't know what combination is actually going to work anymore. I have no money to work with. Everything's either overweight or doesn't have enough energy, and it won't let you do the next mission without building a mech that works.
So that's your game over screen.
You just stop playing.
I guess in a sense, yeah, it's a sort of natural game over screen.
Yeah. Mine was frequently, the game over screen said for me, are you sure you want to quit this application? And I thought, yes. Yes, I do.
Mine was go outside and touch grass.
But you bring up an interesting point, Cameron, about the negatives, which also plays into the sort of meta-narrative of the game, which is if you spend enough time in the negative credit zone, you do get the closest thing Armored Core's got to a game over screen, which is there's a cutscene that plays, and I think it's probably 4 or 5 missions where you're in negative credit, And the cutscene implies that you have sold your body to something called the Human Plus program, which restarts the game, but then you have expanded capabilities. I think it's like you can either boost more, or like you can fire some weapons while moving, while you couldn't have fired those weapons while moving previously. So they're perks, but again, in the FromSoft way, they're very esoteric perks. It's not just like, you now have more health, or, you know, a more useful boon.
I was always irritated at sort of the birth of the online discourse that really came around with the beginning when Elden Ring first came out, where people were like, ooh, like, these games are not accessible to people, like they're too hard. I want there to be an easy mode. And again, as like a prolific consumer of From Software's programming, I thought, like, these games, I was really pleased when people came out like saying this, because I try not to get, you know, too engaged in random Reddit discourse, but people were saying these games do have an easy mode. There's just not an option at the beginning at the menu where you say, hey, I want like enemies to take fewer hits to die or whatever. It's like, no, you want to choose this build. Mm-hmm. These are the weapons you want to use. It's built into the narrative, which is really cool to see that this was happening back in their development stage from 95 to 97, because I had no idea that this was something that they were flirting with when I was 5 years old.
And it's worth noting that all of this, Kingsfield and the early Armored Cores, are before Miyazaki joins FromSoft. I think he gets credited a lot with the way their narrative is successful in a different way than other standard narratives, but that has always been part of the company even prior to his joining.
That's really interesting to think that this is a guy who didn't come in and sort of exert his own authorship over the company, but rather seems more like he was a compatible personality brought on and was able to direct them from there in the direction that From Software has taken.
Yeah, he just knew how to utilize it the best, apparently.
Yeah.
I think with Demon's Souls, it feels like, you know, for the grief I gave it earlier, it feels playable. Like, when you are playing it, it doesn't feel like you're fighting the controls, or it doesn't feel like it's necessarily impossible. It's hard, but you know that if you throw enough time at it, you'll eventually succeed. I think where Armored Core I had some trouble with was just wrapping my head around the controls.
Yeah.
Because it's so esoteric and so removed from our current control schemes.
Well, yeah, especially for a game where just even taking damage, you get punished for it in terms of like going into debt. Like, it really doesn't give you a lot of options of staying mobile and like trying to avoid damage. And especially since you also, you have to spend money to, shoot your gun. Like, every bullet you spend, like every bullet you shoot, like, costs something. So do you want to like risk getting your Armored Core damage to go in close for like the melee kill, or do you want to like stay out of range and not get hit but spend money on firing your weapon? It's such a weird risk versus reward type of gameplay. But like you said, with the controls, it doesn't give you many options to like not take a ton of damage. Unless you guys figured out a way to like be more mobile than I did. I didn't know what the fuck I was doing. I was just like strafing back and forth repeatedly.
Absolutely. It would do the kind of auto target, and I would be over here and I would be firing, and then I'd be over here and I'd be firing, and meanwhile just hoping to avoid whatever bullets I could, but always seeing that number in the top left corner just ticking down.
It's constantly going down, and I feel like the only thing you can do is make it go down slower. There's almost not a time where it isn't ticking downwards, and I can't even like get the boost going, because if I try to like boost like to the side to dodge, I lose my lock onto the target because I don't really I can't really get the control stick to like keep in frame the enemies that I'm supposed to be shooting at.
I would also have an issue where it's like I would start like the boost and I'd be, moving, say, forward, but then maybe there was a ramp or I just did something and then I'm like flying through the sky and I'm like, I hope wherever I land, they're in sight.
Yep, that's exactly it.
I think some of it goes into play. There's a full quote here, but I'll yada yada through some of it. But I saw one YouTuber describe the control scheme as you're not playing as the mech, you're playing as the pilot. And so rather than Armored Core, and really any FromSoft, they're not power fantasies. They're the opposite of it, where they're like weakness fantasies, but you overcoming very great odds despite everything in front of you. And there's a kind of power within that. But because you're piloting a mech and you're playing as the person, all those little heads up displays, you are constantly getting damaged, but it still does a little thing in the bottom right hand corner that's like, you're taking damage, and you're like, fuck you, I know. I feel like you've got that in a car sometimes where it's like it's like oil needs changing, and it's like, fuck you, I know, I'm going to get oil right now.
Your check engine light is on.
Now let's talk about the mission structures. A lot of the missions, at least early on, are just destroy all targets, but there are also missions about locating certain things, getting to a certain destination. In one, you destroy a gang called Dark Soul, which I believe is the first time that phrase is used by a FromSoft game. So there's other, I think it's called the Moonlight Blade, that is in all of their games, even up, like the original Kingsfield games have them. So
it's even in Armored Core 6. I did read about that.
There's a weird meta continuity to everything that they're doing. And I don't know if you guys, I don't think any of us finished the game, right?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
I tried. I made it as far as I could.
I probably got a few hours in. I'd say I maybe got a third to a half of the way in. But I watched a video playthrough of the remainder of the game, and some of the levels do get more complex as you go farther in terms of the goal. So there's like find a thing in a maze and destroy it. It goes back to their early like tiny robot in a maze design idea that they had. There's one where you stop a giant space laser that was going to wipe out humanity. But there's one with like poison in some sections that like erodes the metal, and so you're constantly losing health as you go through.
Of course there's a poison section in a FromSoft game.
Protect a train, which was a mission I failed. So it, a lot of it is just like circle, strafe, and shoot, but there's some complexity that they try and add in with some mission variety.
And I particularly enjoyed the missions early on where it was, you have to destroy this thing, but don't destroy this thing. Mm-hmm. That's important. That makes sure, keeps me focused. There was a moment when it was Kameron who mentioned that he had this impulse to move really quickly, and that is what ultimately led to him failing missions over and over and over again. He's all like, I need to do the Dark Souls method. I need to slow down. I need to be a lot more methodical. And he was playing it before I got my hands on it. And so that was reverberating sort of in my brain as I was playing the game. And unsurprisingly, it didn't help at all. I felt whether I moved quick, moved slow, I was getting shot at and frequently dying.
I think it goes back to that idea of like so much of the game is built around those menu systems of building the mech. Because you're going to constantly get shot at, the mech's defense is sometimes more important than the maneuverability. That said, I did end up with a spider leg tank, which seems to be the
cool.
ideal leg to have. Was the little 4 guys that would go and then there's like a tank tread bottom that works okay too. But
yes,
at some point
yeah.
I found the bipedal mech was not particularly useful in terms of mobility, especially when you're trying to do the circle strafe and maybe trying to boost a little bit. I kind of almost got a hang of it.
Well, that's a fact of evolution, is that we are really sort of poorly designed as far as movement goes compared to most any other creature. We're great for, right? Isn't the whole thing about the human body that we're really good for long distance running and like sustained running, but not for closing gaps, short distances, any sort of like quick adjustable movements we're uniquely bad at, which is why if you stress your body in that way, say playing football or any number of athletics for a significant portion of your early life, you can really damage yourself in a way that limits movement later on. Same is true, it turns out, for mechs.
Mechs are people too. The metaphor just continues. As far as the control scheme that we've talked about that didn't age super well, I talked a little bit about it in regards to Kingsfield, but you strafe with R1 and L1 moves you right and left, but then the up and down functions are R2 and L2. So the directional buttons move you like a tank with right and left, turning right and left, and then you walk forward or walk backwards. And then X jumps or dashes. If you stand still, you jump straight up. If you're strafing, you scooch over to the right or the left. Square is your primary weapon, circle is usually a sword, and then triangle, you swap the weapons out.
Yes.
So it's very different from the twin stick. From what I could tell, it's not DualShock compatible. So even if you have the sticks, I don't think the right stick does shit. And then select is a little map, and the map depends on your head, which I don't know if you ended up seeing, but the amount of map that you get is based on, I think, a radar system coupled with the mech's head is how much gets auto-mapped.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that's really cool. That does actually explain a little bit, I think, around how I was able to navigate later levels once I got a new helm or new head, but I never put it together. Like most with From Software games, I don't spend too much time trying to learn why something is the way that it is. I just try to beat the level and move on to the next one.
What was your weapon loadout by the time you...
God, I really actually did not switch out much from the machine gun missiles that you start the game with. I kept that up. It was mostly, for me... I made it probably like 11 or 12 missions in. Having failed repeatedly, I restarted the game after stopping a particular terrorist cell. I couldn't do every single time. It didn't matter what I tried. I always failed it. And I didn't quite have enough credits. I think I spent the early part of the game buying the wrong pieces and then not really knowing how to build that into my own mech. And so I gave up on that one, but I pursued a couple of other missions. And I really did just keep that missile, machine gun, and then sword capacity and try to vary my own gameplay to maintain my health while still destroying what I could. Ideally, I tried to be as close combat as possible, and then using the machine gun kind of secondary to that, and then really only relying on the missiles as like a last case scenario because they were so fucking expensive to replace.
That's kind of what I ended up doing, is just being a melee, I don't know, melee user. Is that appropriate for a mech? Yeah, just a melee.
I think so.
Melee-oriented fighter.
What about you?
The advice I saw online, again, this is not like my personal brilliance. I cheated by looking up what a good build would be, seemed to be to buy an energy weapon early on. So when I was saying earlier that I only had one weapon for some missions, it was a energy gun that only had 100 bullets, but they were really strong. So it would drain my energy, but, that little bit of extra oomph would make mechs blow up in only one or two shots. So all I had to do was, link up the auto target and then just fire like one or two. And then I was able to get by for a lot of the missions on just that. But then there was one where there were maybe more than 100 little enemies in like a tube. And so I realized that the build that I thought was going to work for everything did not work for everything, because these guys would have needed just like, 3 or 4 bullets. So I needed a clip of like 500. So again, there is not an ideal build, even though I had what was probably one of the more powerful weapons in the game. I feel like it's intentionally designed to make sure that that's still not going to be successful for everything. Eventually, I think I got missiles back.
Did you ever consider, though, with that build, just declining that mission, saying, no, I'm not going to do this one, I don't accept it, and then keeping your loadout? Because that seems, now that I think about it, you could make a pretty decent loadout and then use that to determine whether or not you accepted missions. You wouldn't know whether to accept them until after you tried doing it, unless I guess you were like really paying attention to the lore drops in those like mission briefs. But
yeah, I mean, the game, I think, does encourage a certain level of save scumming, because you can save between every mission, so there's no reason not to go back. What I ended up doing with that mission was not fighting anything, because it was just a get to the end mission.
Oh, smart.
I ended up just flying over all of them when I only had like 10 bullets left because I knew I'd probably need 1 or 2 for the end. And at some point I was like, fuck this, I'll just fly over it because I can fly because I'm a flying mech. So I was getting shot at the whole time, but I was able to make it to the end. And frankly, I probably shouldn't have shot as many bullets as I did because then I wouldn't have lost any money on them.
You just got to get some in. You paid for the weapon, you're going to use the weapon.
So it does look like I didn't realize that I had written down the things that Human Plus can give you. So Human Plus, as we'd mentioned, is sort of the easy mode, but it's also a plot point. If you remain in debt, you get a cutscene where you're sold to medical research. The only thing this changes within the game outside of that perk is that you type in your name at the start of the game, and the only place that shows up is on the leaderboard, the fake in-game leaderboard that just shows how well you're doing against other mecha within this world. So the name that you plugged in at the start shows up in that leaderboard as you start to climb up the ranks. But if you're in Human Plus, so if you fail out and then go back into the game and climb up the ranks, your name is changed to Rebel and then a dash and a 3-digit number. So it gets easier, but you as a person stop existing.
Huh.
Worth it, I think.
Okay. You hear that? Cameron's willing to sell his body for medical research.
I absolutely would. The less of myself that I am, the better things will be.
I have tried to sell like blood and plasma before, and also, like you can sell your jizz, but apparently I'm not tall enough to do so.
Oh no, it's so fucked up.
They don't want my 5'6" semen.
That I'm speechless.
That's just that Tinder shit fucking seeping into our culture.
Yeah, people, for all the talk of short kings, apparently you cannot donate sperm. So
Tyler, I would buy your sperm. I would.
Thank you. Guys, I'd buy both your sperms.
Thank you.
I would probably buy your sperm if it wasn't already in my freezer.
I'm not 100% white, so I'm not sure, how well that'll work out, but I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
I would be astounded if I went into like a sperm donor and I said like, hey, like I would like to donate. What would you pay me? If they looked me dead in the eye and just said, we're not looking for redheads.
Honestly, you could make a case for like, hey, there's so few of us. This is going to be some rare specimens right here.
I shouldn't even have to work. I should be able to go down to the donor, just yank one out once a week and get by with the salary off of that. I agree, Cameron. I'm glad we're on the same page.
So yeah, when you join the Human Plus program, they just do it's like a penis pump, and they just take all your jizz, and then from your jizz, they make a new person who might have their radar replaced with a rectangular radar that's better. Or your energy is doubled.
I like that.
I said earlier that wasn't one of the options, but actually it is an option.
That seems to be like
great.
That's like the best upgrade.
Probably. And these are random, I believe, when you die. So you won't know, and it doesn't tell you. You just start over and you have one of. I was listening to one YouTuber who was like, "Yeah, I died and restarted, and I didn't notice a difference." Like, I think sometimes it might not give you anything.
Oh, interesting.
Fire stance, which is the need to kneel to fire your back weapons, was eliminated. I didn't notice that you needed to kneel.
I didn't know either. This was the thing. I'm like, what? How do you kneel, and how do you use your back?
And also, if you're not bipedal, if say you're using the tank tread or the spider legs, and you don't have knees, how do you kneel?
How does the kneeless kneel? That sounds like something you'd see on the letters arranged in front of a church. Welcome to Austin First Unitarian. How do the kneeless kneel? I would say it's advertising to like veterans who get their legs blown off.
Oh man.
That's the lore. That's the character that you're playing in Armored Core. Is you're playing a man who had his lower half blown to smithereens, and he was put into the Human Plus program to become a mech pilot and was extremely successful. It's a story of adversity.
Yeah,
hero here,
he only feels whole when he's in an Armored Core.
I think his name is Neil.
We're just describing the plot of the first Avatar film.
I was going to say, I think his name's Neil, so he's Kneeless Neil, who no longer needs to kneel.
That's perfect.
All right, we're going to move on from that. There's also the laser blade wave. By pressing the boost button at the right time while swinging the laser blade, a powerful energy wave would be fired off from the blade. And since it doesn't tell you what upgrade you get, how the fuck would you figure that out? You can also cosmetically customize the mech. So you can change the color, change the pattern, and there's a little label that you can make that goes on, I think it's the top left shoulder, and I made mine a little penis.
I don't think I customized the little emblem.
I didn't know that you could. Oh, what a disappointment. That's so cool.
Yeah, in the garage, the only thing it's kind of like the emblem maker in Kirby's Dream Course, which I don't know if either of you have ever played. But
I have not.
You don't enter your name. It's just like a little white square that you draw in, and it's the same with the Armored Core mech design.
Nice.
You can make little lines, little circles. It's like the same interface.
So it's a penis drawing interface.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, basically. I mean, what else are you gonna do? Is draw a little dick. I feel like there's an RPG-like progression system, which I sort of mentioned earlier, but it makes you feel more powerful as you buy more gear. So the difference between the opening missions and the ones where you're on four legs with a laser gun is pretty drastic control and feel-wise. So it's, again, that kind of Souls thing where the hardest part is the beginning, and then you sort of reach little peaks and then go into little valleys, and eventually you peak and are like about as powerful as you can get and feel like this unstoppable killing machine.
That's pretty cool. I honestly, I do like that. That was something, it's been on my mind lately, the idea of offering up, for it, obviously Armored Core, you don't have strict levels that you're increasing in, but I guess the gameplay mechanic that's been on my mind is, as I understand, I haven't played it yet, Baldur's Gate 3 does a relatively early level cap. Like, you hit it in the first area of the game, and then that way you're not really restricted by what you do later on in the game. You can go in any direction, and you're not being guided by, like, I remember the first time I played Dark Souls 2, from the first bonfire that you arrive at, you can go in like any one of 5 different directions, but most of them will kill you immediately. And so that kind of, by doing that, you learn, oh, okay, well, I'm not fit for that area. I'm not fit for that area. Maybe I could handle, okay, this one I can definitely handle. And I feel like there's an element there with Armored Core and the way that you build your mech, determining what missions you can actually handle.
And there's always that question of how to approach difficulty in games, especially games that offer a wide world. Like, if I recall, in Morrowind, Elder Scrolls 3, things don't, like, scale with you, so you can walk into a cave and get destroyed by, like, the strongest mud crab that ever existed, which is something that cool. Bethesda then removes for Elder Scrolls 4 and 5, where everything's, like, scales with you. So
unless you run into the giant and you get knocked into space.
Yes. So there's still challenges there, but it makes the games feel kind of like you're playing the same thing the whole time. I don't think that it's necessarily a great way to approach difficulty. Whereas with Armored Core, as with Demon Souls, as with Dark Souls, the difficulty is built into the play mechanics themselves. You build a mech that's extremely powerful, or maybe if we were good enough at the game, we could just use the starting mech for everything and never die and just power through. I don't know. I haven't looked up that many speed runs, but it's probably possible.
You just got to know just the ins and outs of every single mission.
Be really good at looking up and down with L and R.
God, that's such a terrible control
scheme. I always hit the wrong one. I always hit down when I meant up and up when I meant down.
It was miserable.
Especially if you're flying, like when you're up in the air and it does go kind of like you're already having trouble going left or right, and now you're going up and down.
Yeah, I don't fire while I'm in the air. This is, like, flying is an evasive maneuver only.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, let's talk about the plot, because I am fascinated by some of the things that this game has to say, and we've touched on some of it, but we'll go a little deeper here.
Please.
The game is about 2 warring corporations in an almost apocalyptic setting where humans have been driven underground by the threat of a massive weapon in space. Your character is an uncaring mercenary on sale to the highest bidder. As a meta-narrative, you probably don't pay that much attention to the story, but you are affecting it through an invisible stat depending on what missions you take. You have to make an effort for the story, which is the FromSoft way. There are 2 corporations. One of them is called Chrome, which is a conglomerate based in the capital Isaac City. They are monopolistic and control the city and pharmaceutical development, and by proxy, human growth in the dying world. They are in a corporate and physical war with the Murakumo Millennium, who are involved with industrial manufacturing, in particular the manufacturing of the Armored Core mechas. Both corporations employ the Guards, which is a security force attempting to, quote, keep the peace, unquote, and then there's the Ravens, of which you're part of, which are freelance mercenaries that just get hired and get paid and have no particular allegiance to either of these two. So there's times where two missions will pop up. One will be Murakumo and one will be Chrome, and you can pick based on that, but you're probably going to pick more based on whoever's paying higher, which in itself is kind of a meta-textual thing where the game mechanics influence the plot, because it makes you as the player recognize that you don't really care about the overarching plot. You just care about getting stronger because the game is hard.
I fully agree with that, but one of the elements I really do love is that by the time they introduce in the game, by the time they introduce the other corporation, because all the missions right away, like the first 3 are all from Chrome.
Yeah.
And then they drop the very first Murakumo Millennium mission is the one that offers you the part. And that makes it stand out a little bit. So you're like, oh, wait, who are you and what are you offering? And yeah, they're both corporations and they're both flawed almost by design. Or no, definitely by design. That immediately made me think like, oh, shit. Okay, maybe this other place is where I need to be paying attention. That's what clued me into the idea that I was like, oh, this is where the story's happening. I'm not progressing the story in the missions. I'm progressing it in the mission choices that I'm taking on.
And through your emails. Like, did you, in my playthrough, I think I got an email from, I think it was Murakumo, being like, thank you for helping us out with that mission. Like, we look forward to working with you in the future. So that kind of, that alone kind of influenced me in the missions that I chose, because I'm like, hey, these guys were nice enough to like reach out to me and thank me for my work. So
it's true. Yeah.
Did you guys like,
absolutely.
did you guys find yourself like being a little more loyal to either of the two, or were you just really feeding into that whichever one makes me more money to make myself more powerful, like sort of self-narrative?
The money.
Of course it was the money for you, Tyler.
I'm a capitalist pig.
Murakumo Millennium seemed like the better corporation, which is in the real world not a statement I would ever actually offer out loud.
Yeah.
But here in the game world, I thought, I was like, oh, you guys seem... you know what it was actually that really framed it for me is it was both that they came in. I think they not only were they the first people who offered the part, but also they were the first client to thank me for the action that I took based on my mission selection. Whereas Chrome was the first one that was all like, hey, there are these riffraff and they're demanding that they get paid fairly for their labor, which is ridiculous. Will you come here and just take care of them for us?
Just snuff them out.
Yeah, and I'm all like, fuck you. And then I was all like, 28,000? Okay, like I'll do it begrudgingly, sure, but I need that
So
money.
what if one more corporation doesn't get a union? It's fine.
Not only do they not get a union, they all get
They
exploded.
all fucking die.
Let's not give Starbucks any more ideas.
Oh God, Starbucks, if you're listening.
No, let's be real. Like, Chrome is probably Amazon.
Chrome? You think Chrome's Amazon? Chrome's Google. They literally have a browser named
You're
after
right.
it.
Chrome is Google, and then Murakumo might be Amazon.
Yeah, definitely.
Or Murakumo might... That reminds me more of a Tesla. Like, whatever Elon Musk's shit is.
Oh, this is just Bezos versus Musk.
Honestly, I mean, I read the whole thing as a metaphor for the way capitalism wears down morals of not only those who profit from it, but those who gain no benefit from the definition of capitalism itself. Armored Core captures the near mundanity of dystopia, where the details of everyday horrors become simply so much static when your only focus is making enough money to support yourself.
Well said. I can't disagree that you're right. You're right. There you have it, folks.
The rich get richer, am I right?
But if the rich are going to continue to get richer, the least they could do is give us some fucking mechs.
If I had a mech that I could get to work in like, a couple of minutes, just like fly over, I would take part in capitalism more fully and go, maybe the corporations are right.
Here's my question for y'all. Do you think that we could trick everyone in America if we just like started referring to immigrants like from Mexico as mechs, and we just said we need more mechs, bring the mechs to America? We could just get everyone to be like, yes, like let's arm ourselves with many mechs. I think it could radically reshape the American society.
We can have one, maybe two mechs in every household. A couple of mechs for your children, a couple of mechs for the women out there. Just everybody has access to mechs.
We're gonna have a mech store on every corner.
The armored core of America is the immigrant worker population.
They'll even have restaurants. They can be sort of like, like Mexican restaurants, just on every street corner.
It's mechs I can.
Yes,
not
exactly.
Mechs I can't.
Mechs-I-can.
This has been the typical wordplay section of Mike's and memory cards.
It sounds so racist, but I don't know if it is.
We're clearly talking about the robots.
Spoilers for the end of Armored Core. At the end of the game, the player learns that the world is controlled by an AI or a supercomputer. The world is devoid of morality because it is run by a non-human entity. Now, this is all done pre-Metal Gear Solid and was shockingly ahead of its time for being so esoteric. I disagree with the idea that it takes an unfeeling computer to create an unfeeling world, but I think it's possible that this could also be viewed as a criticism of corporate executives abandoning their humanity, focusing only on bottom lines created by focus groups, analyze data, or in a very relevant way to today's world, AI analysis.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like, again, Armored Core is presenting themes that are really, really taking shape now with the particular brand of American dystopia that we've achieved.
I'm inclined to agree with you. I hadn't really put it in that kind of context. I think because the story is somewhat inaccessible, it's hard to really grapple with it in the way that I would normally if it was like a movie or a TV show or even a more cinematic video game. But once it's laid out in front of me, I don't think that there's really any way of denying that it is awfully relevant, which maybe is part of what inspired them to revisit the franchise with Armored Core 6.
Ooh, that's
obviously,
good.
I don't know the story from like 2 to 5, but
I mean, because like what's going on now with AI is that it's basically going after the arts, like with like AI art quote, or going after voice actors' jobs and going after music making. I think now they're using AI to just like straight up make music. So like, would you think this is how it starts? Like it goes after the arts first to totally devoid the world of just, I don't know, whatever art represents, like human emotion or just like human struggle.
Yeah.
And then it just takes over from there.
Well, one of the most interesting arguments around the sort of advent of artificial intelligence as has happened is that AI is developing sensory capabilities. And right away with like ChatGPT. So what I mean by that is right away what it could do is all these large language models were predictive text in a way, right? You would put in a question, it would analyze the question, and then it would give back the most accurate output based on what it thought was the most likely thing to follow next in a sequence, right?
Mm-hmm.
But all of that was word-based at the beginning. Then you start getting AI that you say, okay, well, instead of putting in all these words online that to create the large language model, what we're now going to do is we're going to put in all of these images into a large language model. It's going to process those images and spit out something, a rough simulacrum of what you're looking for. Now it's developing the sense of sight, right? Because it's identifying images. And then with sound or music, you say, great, now we're going to use in this large language database, instead of, again, words, sounds, beats, binaural tones, whatever and what have you. It can then take that and recreate, or rather create heavy heavy air quotes here, create music based on that. Now it's developing the sense of hearing, the sense of sound, right? And then what we're also noticing, and some of the applications that AI is being used for, is detecting smells. And so that way, in like your home, let's say you don't have a strong sense of smell, it can detect a higher level of carbon monoxide in your home. That's a sense of smell. And as we just feed it this sort of sensory information, AI itself is developing a very rough simulacrum of our 5 senses, basically.
So that's fucking terrifying.
Can AI look at any surface and know exactly what it would feel like to lick it? Did you guys know that that is a human trait, that you can look at any surface, and as long as you know what it feels like, you can imagine the feeling on your tongue if you lick it?
I did not know that.
This is fucking with me. I'm looking at a ton of different surfaces right now, and
I'm literally looking at my walls.
Yeah. I've got foam here. I've got just wall, carpet, a wicker basket.
Someone pointed it out to me once, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. So that's my barrier for AI, is as long as it doesn't know what any surface feels like to be licked, then it's not human yet.
Do I lick the walls for this podcast?
Honestly, it makes me proud to be a human.
I can lick anything.
I know exactly what it's gonna taste like, or imagine what it's gonna taste like.
I don't think it's the taste. I think it's the texture.
Like the sensation.
The texture.
I don't really know what the walls.
The mouth feel.
It's the mouth.
The exquisite mouth feel.
The snozberries taste like snozberries.
Oh, is Willy Wonka just a metaphor for AI? Much the same way as Armored Core. Or
Willy
Metal Gear
Wonka was a
Solid.
robot the whole
It could
time.
be a metaphor for capitalism too, because Willy just wanted to give his company to the least capitalistic of the children, the one who was the most generous. So,
Because he himself had been ground down by the capitalist system. Not to mention the colonialist undertones.
By the chocolate mafia in the new Timothée Chalamet movie?
The chocolate cartel.
The chocolate cartel, that's what it was.
that also feels racist against Mexicans, so that's another recurring theme in this episode.
The entire country of Mexico is really taking a beating. I even thought that the name of the capital city in Armored Core, Isaac City, that's really unique. Isaac City.
Yeah.
What could that possibly be named? Because I would think Isaac.
Asimov, right?
Oh, I guess, yeah, Asimov
Isaac.
would make the most sense
maybe.
there. Okay. All right. I just thought Isaac was like a
in
Hispanic
Hebrew.
name.
Oh. Ooh, yeah.
No,
let's
Isaac in
go deep
Hebrew
there.
means one who laughs or rejoices. Isaac is in the Bible, right?
Yes. Isaac is, in fact, my brother. Esau is Jacob's brother. Whew.
Whoa.
We're going to lose our Christian listeners.
And we'd already mentioned that there is an invisible tracking stat showing your alliance to either of the two corporations. It doesn't affect the ending. It just affects the missions that you can take along the way once you get towards the end bit. But once you do clear the game, all 50 missions become available to you. So
that's good.
It's not necessarily giving you incentive to replay for the narrative. You could if you wanted, but because it's so sort of in the background, once you finish the game the first time, you can just go through and tick off all the boxes that you hadn't ticked off.
That's good. I like that they do that. I was worried when I noticed some missions disappearing, and I was like, wait, that was going to give me so much money.
Yeah, I felt the same way. Do we know how many missions you get in a campaign? Like, based on your allegiance? Does it cap out 25, 30?
That's a great question. I'm actually not 100% sure. I do think it's probably about 30-ish.
That's what I would think. Like, if it's going to give you 50 at the end, then... Because I was thinking to myself, like, oh, how many missions are there? Oh, 50? Oh, how many in your initial playthrough?
34 for a standard playthrough, it looks like.
34, okay.
That seems about right.
Yeah, I mean, 16 extra missions after that just to play and challenge yourself. That's a perfect sort of post-game amount, I think. We've already kind of talked about the games that really defined us as gamers growing up, and we're obviously going to get into more of that when we talk about what we'll be doing next week. But I would love to meet somebody for whom Armored Core was that game for them, because that's somebody with a completely... This is the thing I would suspect, is that this game takes a very sort of bleak view of humanity, of the system that we live under, of capitalism generally, of authoritarianism and corporatocracy. But I feel like the person who is all like, Armored Core was my favorite game when I was a kid is probably kind of leaning towards authoritarianism, kind of defensive of... I just don't think they'd be like a leftist, you know?
They may not have gotten some of the subtleties of the plot, especially given the time frame.
And you can't really blame them for how, as you said, esoteric it is.
And speaking of that sort of bleak worldview, graphically and audibly, it's also a fairly sparse game. And I feel like this early FromSoft is known for that starkness. They've definitely gotten more visually lush as time has gotten on. But in those original games, it was all very blocky. And believe it or not, Armored Core 1 is heads and shoulders above the first two Kingsfield in terms of fidelity and polygon count. But that being said, the draw distance is pretty short. There's some music, but it's a lot of the missions just have footsteps. Yeah, well, I found that the music kicks in particularly combat-heavy either fights, like fight missions that go by really quickly, or sometimes you'll hit like almost a boss near the end of a mission or a slightly stronger mech, and then all of a sudden kind of a techno beat kicks in.
Oh, okay.
I listened to the soundtrack at work one day, filling in my Excel spreadsheets, how apropos, and was just jamming out to Armored Core 1, and the music that is there fucking rules. It's just not used very often. It's very of the time. Like, it's very that kind of late 90s, I think it's called like breakbeat, whatever you would have referred to as techno at the time.
I am so pleased to hear you not describe the music as being late 90s edgy, because if I had to listen to that word get dropped any more after editing our last episode, I would have lost my mind.
This game is stark, but I wouldn't ever call it edgy. It doesn't feel like it's trying to be dark. It feels like it is dark and dystopian naturally without being like, whoa, the fucking 90s. It is what it is.
I fully agree. It occupies a lot of that same sort of like near future sci-fi that like Ace Combat, I think, also hit that nerve for me.
Yeah. Another AC.
Yeah, that's true.
Assassin's Creed.
Animal Crossing.
Same game.
Damn, I want to do another one. Anyway.
I know there's a lot of them. I saw a post about it the other day. Actually, in doing research for Armored Core, I had typed in AC1 at one point, and I was like, that was too many things. But if we're finished talking about the game, I don't know that I have much more to say about the game itself, unless either of you have any more points you want to add on.
No, other than talking about it again is really making me want to jump back into it.
Yeah, this is one of the tragic elements of doing this podcast is like I do enjoy playing the games in the lead up to the podcast, but then when it's time to switch over to another game for the next episode, I'm really like reinvigorated. I'm like, oh, I really want to improve.
Yeah.
Of course, like in playing Armored Core on my PSP, I did not have access to the like Tyler, the issue you were having with L2, R2,
oh, yeah.
That's not there. So looking up and down, it's like you can use that little like thumbstick on the PSP, but it's not super responsive. And I don't know if that's a fault of the emulator or the fact that my PSP is 15 years old and that's just to be expected. But it would like, oh, you could kind of change where you were looking and then it would get stuck there until I moved a certain way and it would reset. And so it made the game difficult, but not in a way that actually felt breaking for me. Like I still was able to make it, like I said, about 10 missions in before I was like, I'm capped out. I've got other things to focus on. Anyway, yeah, a very enjoyable experience overall, I would say, though.
Yeah.
I was
despite
surprised.
The frustrations.
Yeah, and it's one of those games that's got a kind of an it factor that I find very hard to describe, whereas like Crash has this very straightforward and quote-unquote good level design. Tekken is very technologically sound and well-balanced. Armored Core doesn't play great. The story is obtuse. It doesn't explain a lot of systems, and some of the systems that are there are not necessarily well implemented or fair. But there's something about it that made it engaging to me. And even when here's the FromSoft thing, even when I failed and was like, I'm kind of frustrated by this, I would cool off for a bit. And then the next morning I was like, maybe I'll fit in a couple missions before work.
Yeah, Yeah,
It's the giant robots.
yeah, it's hard to say no to giant robots. There's a lot in Armored Core, I think, to capture your attention. I don't think that there's any one element that sells it more than, I guess, some of these other games that we talked about or are going to talk about, but it is this odd fusion of all of it that gives you just enough in every area where you're compelled to revisit it. I think the game itself is more than the sum of its parts, is I think what I'm trying to say here.
Much like your mech itself.
Ah.
So Armored Core was reviewed favorably, though the praise was not unanimous. Famitsu gave the game a 28 out of 40, which is a little lower than I expected, while some American outlets scored it more in the 80% range. I find the response interesting since the reviewers would either praise or criticize the same aspects of the game, respectively. So the graphics either had a high attention to detail or were bland, fitting, and workable. I also think some folks just didn't get it as far as the plot goes, which is understandable, considering subtlety was not necessarily the norm in console gaming in 1997.
You got to do a lot of the work to get that story.
It was criticized for being underbaked or straightforward, despite everything that we've already talked about.
2 words I would not describe this game as.
I cannot find sales figures for this game. I can find sales figures for Armored Core 2 and everything past that, but Armored Core 1, I have no clue. I know that it's pretty hard to come by these days, with some discs occasionally reselling for $100 or more. This says to me that it was maybe not the rollicking success as some of its contemporaries were, at least as far as the US market. Regardless of that, it was re-released for the PS3, the PSP, and the PS Vita as part of Sony's PS1 Classics banner, and it's also on the Japanese PlayStation Classic mini console. It's not on the American one, but it's on the Japanese release.
Oh, neat.
Me and Kameron talked about it a little bit offline, but the difference between the American and European PlayStation mini library and the Japanese one is pretty vast and really shows the difference between how that system was received and viewed in each region. Like, the Japanese version has the first 2 Arc the Lad games, but then we get stuff like Cool Borders. So,
shit.
And Twisted Metal too.
So this is, to me, the surprise of the podcast and looking up FromSoft stuff, because I did not realize this. Armored Core would be FromSoft's flagship series until the release of Demon's Souls in 2009. While the company would produce RPGs and story-driven games, here's the shout-out I mentioned earlier, shout-outs to Echo Knight and Lost Kingdoms for the PS1 and the GameCube respectively, both bangers. They would mostly be known as the Mecha Game guys for a little over a decade before the Soulsborne became kind of the only thing that they made.
Yeah, I knew these guys. I knew these guys as the Armored Core developers before Souls, which is kind of nuts.
By the time Demon's Souls came out, like, if in my mind they were the Mech Game guys, I probably would have been like, I'm good. No, thank you.
But to show how vast this was, Armored Core on the PS1 would have 2 standalone expansions. We'll cover them some other time, but they can both use your existing Armored Core 1 save. The series would proceed in this fashion for a while. Technically, for the first decade or decade and a half of its life, there were only 5 mainline numbered releases, but all of them would have additional expansions, making the count actually 15 games by the time it went into a soft retirement by 2013. So it was typically the one initial release followed by 2 follow-ups. I think one of them had an initial release and 3 follow-ups, and then one had, I think it was Armored Core 5, and then 1 follow-up. Those were not received super well, which is when the games went into a kind of dormancy around Demon's Souls times.
This is one of the reasons I am trying to make a change about. I feel like sometimes there's so many entries or installments in a game series that I just feel like, I can't jump in at number 6, right? Or number 9. I'm trying to get away from that and just be like, I don't need all the history. Some things might be lost on me, but if I want to play this game, jump in on the 7th installment or what have you. That's resolution.
And so sort of on that, I think a starting point would be that out of nowhere, I think they had announced that they were working on a new Armored Core game maybe around like 2018. But then just, again, kind of out of nowhere in 2023, Armored Core 6 was released to critical and commercial acclaim for modern consoles, putting the dormant series back into the spotlight. Because of this success, the series is back as a viable option for continued development, which you absolutely could not have said about a decade ago. So, we may see more mechas soon, which is especially inspiring considering its humble origins as a passion project by a couple of software developers making business tools and dreaming big.
As big as those robots.
That's the robot.
Thank you once again for listening to another episode of Mics and Memory Cards. This show was researched by Tyler Kubat, hosted by Tyler Kubat, Jacob Schatz, and Kameron Fort. It was edited by Jacob Schatz and social media by Kameron Fort. Please tune in next week when we begin our coverage of the phenomenal Final Fantasy VII ahead of its re-release. In the meantime, my name's Jacob.
My name's Tyler.
And my name is Kameron.
And you've been listening to Mics and Memory Cards.